Tom?
Yes.
Yeah. Should we start?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll kick off in that case. I'm just going to introduce our report. It's called The Path Towards a New Constitution, Managing the Deadlines of the Chilean Constitutional Convention. And I just want to share screen because I have a few slides just to share with you very quickly. Can everybody see these? I hope everyone can see that.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's the report. You know, it was the result of a very productive collaboration between the Constitution Transformation Network at the University of Melbourne and the Foro Constitucional at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. So it started with discussions in June 2021 between Cheryl Saunders and Francisco Urbina and blossomed into a full working group, bringing in Alejandro Valle, Gonzalo Candia on the UC side, and myself, Anna Jedgetz and Charmaine Rodriguez on the CTN side. So we worked together during July and August to tease out key issues facing the Constitutional Convention, the constraints of the legal framework, and the potential lessons to be learned from previous constitution drafting processes worldwide. So we looked at states like Nepal, South Africa, and Brazil, but we stayed mindful of the need to take the Chilean process on its own terms. So it's a rather late launch because the report text was actually finalized on the 30th of August last year and published in September. So at the time of writing, the process was still in its very early stages. You know, we found ourselves relying on the draft rules of the convention, for example. But I just want to say a few things about the report structure very quickly. So we designed the report to be as accessible as possible to a policy audience and the convention members themselves if they took a look at it. So it begins with key points and recommendations, and then you get the full substance of the report divided into 5 sections. So the first is the case for a timeline, and in the report we note that there's no perfect length for a constitution drafting process, but that it needs to be long enough to have time to reach an agreement and a sustainable agreement, but short enough not to lose momentum. And we don't cover this in the text, but of course there's wide variation worldwide. You know, South Africa was 2 years, Tunisia over 4 years, the US well under a year, and different bodies have different responsibilities during that process. But our main point here is that the convention requires a clear timeline for the entire drafting process to avoid running out of time and to identify key tasks. And we suggested approaching this as 3 phases. First is installation of the convention and settling its main bodies and rules. The second is an elaboration phase involving committee deliberations, public participation, and agreeing specific articles. And the third is a conclusion phase involving compilation of text and harmonization of the full draft. In the second section, we looked at variables, you know, what we don't know. So we were thinking about things like how the convention would organize its work, what committees would be formed, how they would interact with the plenary in approving and rejecting constitutional provisions, how thematic committees would work to avoid overlaps and ensure complementarity, whether in practice the final negotiation and approval of proposals would be mostly done at the committee or the plenary level, and what role a harmonization committee might play. And we pointed to, you know, the requirement for individual clauses to be adopted by a 2/3 majority as further complicating the already complicated question of how the committees and plenary would interact and affecting the design and operation of a timeline. I just wanted to show you what that timeline looked like very quickly. So in the third section of the report, we look at, you know, what the 3 drafting phases might be in detail. And we offered that a 12-month process would be more feasible than the 9-month process initially envisaged. So that's the 4th of July instead of 4th of April, which is now just 2 weeks away. So we tried to give a broad sense of how long each phase would take, about 2 months for phase 1. The longest phase would be phase 2 in or around 5 or 6 months, and then the remainder being phase 3, the conclusion phase. But big issues here included, you know, having adequate public participation would require good time management because it's so time consuming. And also that there's only provision for 1 3-month extension under the Constitution. In the 4th section, deadlocks and deadlines, we emphasize the need to resolve deadlocks and disagreements as they arise rather than waiting for the final stages of the process. And we draw some insights from the South African process in the 90s here, including the significant role of the committee of experts at key junctures. But we also consider whether modern communications might allow for alternatives in the Chilean process, like using technology to garner the public's views on disputed provisions. In the final section, we looked at the options if the convention was struggling to reach agreement as the 12-month deadline approaches. And I get the sense that this is going to be one of the biggest issues we might be discussing today. So these include railroading, speeding up the process, getting a second extension through a constitutional amendment, over-inclusion of disputed provisions as a compromise, or the fourth one is under-inclusion, just leaving out disputed issues out of the text. So that's it. That's the report in a nutshell. At the CTN side, we've really valued getting the opportunity to work with Francisco, Alejandra, and Gonzalo on this. And it'll be really interesting to hear in more detail how these issues have played out since the report was published.
Thank you very much, Tom. So I would like to thank you everyone for joining in this activity sponsored by the Centro de Justicia Constitucional of Universidad del Desarrollo, the Constitution Transformation Network of University of Melbourne, and Foro Constitucional UC. I would like also to thank, of course, to Tom Daly and to Raúl Sánchez Uribarri, who had the initiative to organize this. So the plan is also to launch a special issue that we published last year in the Hague Journal of the Rule of Law. In case you want to see it, I posted the link in the chat. Raúl and I, we co-edited this issue with the help of Ronald Janse at the journal. And some of the non mutually exclusive questions that were interesting for us in this project were, is the convention succeeding in achieving large multi-partisan agreements that can end in the enactment of a new constitution? What does the new constitution need to establish to respond to the social demands that served as the political force for the constitution making process? Are democratic institutional arrangements in danger in Chile? How to fix a broken party system so that representative democracy can be sustainable? What can the Chilean experience offer to scholars interested in comparative constitutional studies and constitution making? What are the main risks of the Chilean constitution making process, and how does the Chilean process relate or compare to other processes in the region? So our special issue answers some of these questions and others in 6 papers. The issue opens with an introduction by Lisa Hilving. It then follows with a paper by Javier Couso, who explains the political and historical context of the constitution-making process and describes it as a procedurally regulated process. Julieta Suárez-Cao then argues that the process succeeded to distance itself from the political elites by focusing on the demands of the social movements. My paper, co-authored with Marcela Prieto, used the Chilean case to illustrate on the conditions of an interim constitution's self-enforcement capacity. And we propose that how radical the kinds of rival justificatory narratives are matter for respecting the multi-partisan agreements that sustain the interim constitution. We claim that there is an interim constitution in place in Chile right now. Eduardo Arenas then made a critical assessment of the current Chilean constitution regarding the right to healthcare. He proposed the basis for a new regulation. Then Raúl Sánchez Uribarri, Carlos García, Miguel Ángel Martínez compared the Chilean process with the Venezuelan constitution-making process, at least in the early stages of those processes, and they noted the differences between them, claiming that the Chilean process is different because it's more consensual, moderated, and rule-bounded. Finally, Gabriel Negreto identified 3 features that are both normatively desirable and that are indeed part of the process: an assembly bound by pre-existing rules, inclusive mechanisms of representation, and direct citizen participation. So some months have passed after the special issue was published, and new questions related to this project arrived. When we published this volume, the process was a moving target. It still is a moving target, but we can evaluate how these answers and these questions have evolved. So was Javier Couso, for example, correct in saying that the process was procedurally regulated and that it was supposed to follow an institutional path? In Sánchez García and Martínez's account, is the Chilean path indeed following a consensual, moderated, and rule-bounded path? Is the respect for the rules dependent on the conditions that Verdugo and Prieto suggested? Were they right in suggesting that maintaining the course of the procedure was dependent on how radical the revolutionary and the evolutionary narratives could find a common ground? Was Suarez-Cao's argument about social movements correct? Was Arena's proposal consistent with the demands and proposals that we see within the convention? Finally, even though we know that the three conditions that Negreto identified were present at the moment he wrote his article, are those conditions going to be maintained? Are they maintained so far? So we have now a panel of excellent speakers. We have asked them to prepare very short presentations of 5 minutes each, and then we will have a discussant. Alexandra Uneus will discuss these remarks. Alexandra will also moderate and chair the panel discussion. We have, so we will have Isabela Ninat from Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez, Cheryl Sanders from University of Melbourne, Raúl Sánchez Urribarri from La Trobe University, Gabriel Negreto from the Political Science Department of Universidad Católica, and Francisco Urbina and Gonzalo Candia, both from Universidad Católica. We have asked Professor Runeus, as I told you before, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison to chair, moderate, and offer some reactions, and we will then have a discussion. Please take notes of the questions that you may have. We will have a Q&A and a discussion after, so you can place these questions later at the end of the event. And just for you to know, we will be recording this event, and we will upload it to a streaming platform, probably YouTube. So Alexandra, the panel is all yours.
All right, so thank you, Sergio and Raul, for inviting me. It's an honor to moderate, and I will begin. We have 6 speakers. We'll go in the order that this was announced, and each of the speakers will reflect briefly, just for 5 minutes, talk about their paper or the issue at large that was published. And so I will keep time. And then after that, I'll offer just very brief comments, and we'll open it up, I believe, Sergio, to a discussion among the panelists, and then to a more general Q&A. So let's begin with Gabriel Negreto, who was here. So 5 minutes, Gabriel.
Oh, thank you very much, Alexandra. Thank you, Sergio, Raul, and Tom for organizing this event, and everybody else who is participating in this. As Sergio stated, yes, we started to work on this project early on last year, about June, July. So more or less at the time that the convention was elected, and a pressing issue at that juncture was the rules of procedure. And certain debates that that emerged, one of them being whether the 2/3 rule will be respected. And that debate actually was not ended until relatively late in the process, I would say until September, October. So by the time that we were already publishing these papers. As a way of introduction, I have to say that I was concerned with 2 issues in my article. One of them was to indicate in what sense, on the one hand, the Chilean process was radically different from recent experiences that we had in Latin America, with sovereign constituent conventions on the, for one thing, unilateral processes or processes with under the control of a single political group or movement, and processes where citizen participation was either an instrument of the dominant party or movement, or was just simply a window dressing type of mediation. So that's something that I wanted to highlight from the very beginning in my article, and also indicate, on the other hand, that the 3 features that were in contrast to this relatively recent experiences in Latin America. On the one hand, a constituent convention bound by law, inclusive elite participation, and several instances of citizen participation. we're also aligned with the best practices that we have in comparative perspective in terms of democratic constitution making, for which I mean, processes that not only claim to be democratic, but also when you look at the effects of the new constitution after this constitution was implemented, the effects tend to be positive rather than neutral or negative. So that's one of the things that I wanted to highlight in the paper. But I also wanted to raise some concerns about the process, and I raised two. And now, with the benefit of hindsight, I will include many more. But so the ones that I mentioned were the fact that, on the one hand, the Constituent Assembly, the Constitutional Convention, was composed of independents, representative of social movements that saw themselves in the vast majority as the voice of the people. So that, to me, created the danger that many delegates will see their task as simply translating, majority desires into constitutional provisions. And I argue that that could be a risk, not only because some provisions will be ineffective, even if they translated popular wishes exactly, but that also it's impossible to interpret in a very cohesive and coherent way different popular demands that sometimes do not, that sometimes contradict themselves. And the second risk that I highlighted was the fact that this convention, because of its representation, mostly by people from in the social movements, independents, and from the left generally, could tend to be very reactive. That is, to design the new constitution, not looking at the new institutions as a promise for a better future in which some of the previous institutions could be reformed and adapted to a better type of democracy, but simply to reject, the legacy of the past. So I will finish by saying that at this point, with what we know now, with the substantive discussions and what is going on, I will add two more risks. One, the fact that after the election of the legislature, we know that the convention is not political representative of the Chilean society. It is representative of the diversity of the Chilean society in social, cultural, ethnic, and gender terms, but not politically. And second, that we are now seeing the cost of having a convention that lacks the capacity to articulate and mobilize collective action, for forging agreements within the assembly. That I will finish. Thanks.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank you for keeping to time. Next, we have Francisco Urbina.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you especially to Tom, Sergio, and Raul for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate. I will speak mainly about the document that Tom so helpfully introduced, called The Path Towards a New Constitution, Managing the Deadlines of the Chilean Constitutional Convention, which was produced through a joint collaboration between PUC and the Constitution Transformation Network at Melbourne Law School. And we're always very grateful of the generosity of our colleagues at the Constitution Transformation Network in working with us on this project. So in the now 4 minutes that I have, I will address three issues. First, the point of the document. Talking about deadlines is difficult in the sense that that is very much subject to contingencies. Yet we choose to address this because we thought it was of great practical importance, and that's also why the nature of the document is a policy document aimed at civil society convention members and at the citizenry in general. And perhaps the main argument we want to raise is a very basic one, but one that at the early stages of the process could be easily missed, which is that deadlines matter, and they will arrive someday, and it's very important to comply with them. Managing time matters for the quality of the process, and there are a number of features of this process that makes it especially challenging to manage time. The fragmented nature of the convention, some of the features that Gabriel just mentioned. Many of the actors are not professional politicians. The demand for public participation, which is important, but it's costly in terms of time. Lack of support and leadership from the executive. Very importantly, that the convention was a new body, and thus it required installation, and that requires logistics, need to approve rules, and so on. And that's one specific element that it seemed that it was necessary to sort of convey to the public at large, that the convention will not start writing articles right away, and that's as it should be. And then, of course, there is a deadline as well that also creates a challenge. Their deadline set in the Constitution, and there's an original deadline of 9 months, which can be extended to 12 months. So the first issue is to sort of raise awareness of that issue early on in the process. The second point is that the deadline, the second point I want to mention in the presentation is that the deadline has become an issue now, right? So now that we're approaching the end, and here we can sort of recall the recent words of President Quinteros, President of the Constitutional Convention, that mentioned that it would be desirable to have more time, that the convention is facing the pressure of time. This is something also that we're seeing in the work of the convention, who's working long hours to sort of be able to produce all the necessary work. And in general, one could say that the commissions have submitted about a third or fourth of their work to the plenary. This is sort of hard to schedule, but to give a sense, and in some cases, most of the material has been rejected and is being sent to be discussed again by the commissions, as I will mention below. The third point is to sort of signal some issues coming in the future regarding the deadlines. So there is one overarching question that we address in the paper, as Tom mentioned, regarding the relation between commissions and plenary. And the commissions have been discussing their proposals and sending them to the plenary. And I guess we thought when we were writing the document that most of the work would be done at the commissions, and that has occurred. But at the same time, we're seeing the plenary operating as a real filter to the commissions and sending, in some cases, a lot of work back. So a couple of examples. Very recently, the Commission of Systems of Government, which is seen as a sort of very strategic key commission, deciding on the system of government, creating a proposal on the system of government, submitted its proposals to the plenary, which was largely rejected at the suggestion even of the members of the commission that acknowledged that the proposal was not ready yet at this stage. And almost all of also in other commissions, say the Commission on the Environment, almost all of the articles that were submitted were rejected by the plenary. And so this translates into a requirement for more time. A second issue will be the role of the Harmonization Commission, which will operate starting April 28th. Its competence is only about stylistic matters, but it's difficult to separate style from substance. And if the process is rushed, we're likely to see perhaps more duplication, incoherence, and other such aspects. So that may create some pressure for the Harmonization Commission to take a more active role. So that's something to see. And we foresaw in the report as well that probably when there is a full draft of the commission of the Constitution, and there'll be a need there'll be a demand for making amendments and suggestions and so on. And just one last issue, a more political one, we're still to see what will be the role of the new president in influencing, coordinating, if there will be any role by the president in this process, and will be the role of Congress in maybe passing a possible extension. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francisco. We'll go now to Gonzalo Candia.
Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. Thank you everyone for having invited me to this discussion. Well, as it has been said before, I work in this joint work between the University of Melbourne and Universidad Católica Law School regarding this paper that it was previously presented. One of our main concerns during the conversation in those months in which we were working on this particular paper, one of our main concerns was the role that the technical secretariat of the convention was going to play in the future. Two reasons justify that concern First, the technical secretariat was one of the few specialized institutions of the process that the current constitution established. According to the legislative intent, the technical secretariat was critical, to ensure an acceptable outcome at the end of the process. And second, because comparative experience shows us that a robust technical secretariat promotes not just an informed discussion, but also it promotes consensus around what represents constitutional standards. So two reasons why we consider that the institution of the technical secretariat was truly relevant for the process. So we assume, and I personally assume, that the technical secretariat was a key actor for the process. This idea was confirmed once the rules of procedure of the convention were approved. Indeed, the rules gave to the technical secretariat powers not only to respond questions regarding comparative constitutional law, for example, but also the rules of procedure gives powers to the secretariat to issue a proposal of timetable for the discussion, a proposal that had to be approved by the chair of the convention at the beginning of the process, and even the rules of procedure gives powers to the secretariat to supervise the work within commissions, within the different commissions inside the convention. However, this role that looked quite robust has been progressively eroded, throughout the process. What facts allows us to say so? And first of all, the technical secretariat had a pretty limited budget. A pretty limited budget. It has to share with other institutions within the convention just a 14% of the whole budget of the convention. The second element to say so is the limited number of members. Today, the plenary of the convention has favorably voted only 8 people. So the technical secretariat is officially constituted just by 8 people with no comparative law expert in the team. The first appointments made by the plenary of the convention were 4 professionals of the Library of Congress. From those 4 professionals, just one was a lawyer, and not a lawyer with a comparative constitutional law expertise. Even the chair has not passed yet the regulations about the technical secretariat, rules that the convention rules of procedures requested. So today, there is no specific rule that identifies, for example, the main requirements to be a part of that secretariat. There is no formal procedure regarding the selection of members, for example, specific criteria to do so. With neither people nor enough resources, the technical secretariat's profile has lost a real significance for the constitutional debate inside the convention. A possible explanation that I want to share with you is related to what Professor Negreto said just a couple of minutes ago. The fact that in a constitutional project like the Chilean one, which wants to be transformative, the presence of traditional expertise represents a problem. May some members of the convention fear, maybe, that expert knowledge could orient debates to constitutional standards that do not represent what the convention truly desires. So maybe that is a possible explanation about a possible explanation regarding the weaknesses of this technical secretariat. However, beyond causes, the absence of a robust technical secretariat may negatively impact the discipline required to achieve the convention's timetable. In what sense? First, the absence of substantial expertise in comparative constitutional law within commissions or in the plenary makes much more difficult to agree a point of departure for the discussion, which directly increases the time in debate. It is like building on the scratch, so that makes more difficult to advance the debate. A weak technical secretariat has no authority at all to supervise the way how commissions work out, as the rules of procedures says. This lack of supervision contributes to create scenarios of procedural wrongs that could make the debate less efficient. And finally, the lack of significant expertise makes much more difficult to build consensus in regard of the final constitutional outcome. More expertise favors consensus because of the weight of constitutional authority. But in the absence of that authority, to achieve that level, that consensus could take more time. So what for the future? I think the convention has still an opportunity to reinforce the institutional capacities of the technical secretariat by assuming the need to achieve a very demanding timetable that requires to promote some basic consensus. So I think still there are some chances to reinforce these institutional capacities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gonzalo. We now have Isabela Ninata.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. Good afternoon and good morning, I guess, to some of you. So I did not speak with Gabriel before this panel, but I think we're going to touch upon the same issues. And I want to focus, because I have 5 minutes, on one specific issue, and that I think has sort of not been given the relevance that I think it has. And it's how we conceive in this process political representation. Of course, this is a question that has been debated in countries, right? Very different countries for the last years with particular importance, but I think the constitutional discussion and process currently in Chile shows just how relevant this question remains. And there are two sides to the question, and I want to focus on one of them. The first one, which is the one that I will speak about, is the role of political parties as the avenues for representation. And I think there's a second one that has to do with the discussion of identity in the configuration of the model of representation. And that has to do with gender parity, indigenous issues, and other issues that we have very much been present in the conversation. But let me go back to the first one, right? And particularly the role of political parties. In part of the articles that sort of give way to this conversation, there's a phrase that is repeated, which is that the convention, quote unquote, has not been captured by political parties. And that is sort of put forth as a good news for the process. Let's remember that independent candidates had great success in the electoral process of May last year in Chile. They won as independent candidates running in political party lists. They won as independent running in independent lists. And then they won also as independents running by themselves. So as we know, and as it has been mentioned, the results from the election of May last year left a very fragmented assembly. No political force has a dominating position. But I think fragmentation does not stop there, but it is reinforced because of the number of independent representatives within each political group. So we have a lot of political groups and then a lot of independents within each one. Thus, we see now that leadership is scarce. Systematic views within each group are difficult to put together. Organizing different processes of negotiation is hard to coordinate, and we have seen that over the last weeks. Commissions function very fragmentedly. And I think that what we are seeing since February, since the plenary session started voting, in part responds to this scenario. And I think this situation has two consequences. One is the question about the substantive regulation, and the other one is, well, what comes after the exit plebiscite, as we call it in Chile, the transitional process from one constitution to the other. For the first consequence, I think the fundamental question that should catch our attention is how political representation is conceived in the draft for the new constitution. Is this understood under the traditional framework that we are used to for representative democracy? And if so, what is the space for the political parties to operate? What is the role for social movements? Should the discourse against political elites translate as a different arrangement? What is the role of direct democracy, and what is the extension and also its limits? We're used to say that democracy functions with political parties and that it needs strong political parties. But the issue I think now is if that will remain a slogan or how will it translate to the text? So far, and I say so far because things change very rapidly from one week to the next, I am skeptical of the advances. Many ideas that do not reinforce the role of political parties have been present in the debate, but have not been put forth in the draft. But the issue, as I just mentioned, remains to be decided in the next political weeks. And just a note about the second consequence, which is what happens after the exit plebiscite. What is the draft line after the writing process, taking the question about the writing process itself? How will this transition between a constitutional text to a new constitution, if the new constitution is approved, will go forth? And I think in that, the role of adapting legislation, of dictating new norms, of establishing the new institutional designs will need political parties. How will they be included in this process, especially with a Congress that has a very, very different configuration from the one that the convention has? And just a final note, I think the political parties were key in the initial moment of the constitutional process. The agreement of November 15 was drafted by the political parties from across the spectrum, except some the ones that remain that did not sign, the Communist Party in particular, but it was signed, and it was signed in Congress. I think political parties have been seen with distance, with mistrust for a long time in Chile. They do not enjoy citizen support, but I think, and I maintain, that designing a system that reinforces their role is crucial for the next decades in Chile. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Now we turn to our foreign non-Chilean experts, starting with Cheryl Saunders.
Thank you, Alexandra. Look, it's a great pleasure to participate in this webinar, and I've been fascinated by the presentations so far. Can I also say that it was a great pleasure to collaborate with our colleagues from PUC in writing this paper on managing the deadlines. I think in many ways it was a model of constructive comparative collaboration, and we certainly learned a great deal from them. In rereading this paper for today, I was struck by the relative novelty, bizarrely, of some of the issues it raises. And let me mention 4 of those in particular. First of all, what considerations feed into decisions about the length of a constituent process of this kind? And as Tom mentioned, we actually ended up taking the view that you could be too long or too short, that there were pressures operating at both ends of the spectrum. Secondly, whatever the length of the process, how should it be managed? Clearly, our paper assumes that there should be a timeline, but it also emphasizes that the timeline should be flexible. Things always go wrong in a constitution-making process, and you need the flexibility to respond to those events. And in the end, as others have said, we decided on 3 phases, and there's nothing rocket science about that: installation, elaboration, and conclusion. But then the next issue was how to divide the total time between each of those phases. How long will installation actually take? You know, there's a temptation to think, oh, well, installation's just the startup phase. That won't take very long, but inevitably, I suspect it always takes longer than you think. Second issue, in thinking about the relative length of the phases, what is going to be the manner of interaction between the commissions and the plenary? Surprisingly banal issue in many ways, but relatively novel. And then how will public participation take place, and when will it fit in this timeline? And then the final issue that I just want to mention is how to ensure that the final draft that comes out the other end is coherent. Now, at that early stage in our discussions, I was also struck by how little guidance on many of these matters could be gleaned from comparative experience, despite the plethora of constitution making around the world over the last 30 years. In terms of that key issue of duration, of course, there's plenty of examples of length of process, but they showed a huge range from a few months in the case of Timor-Leste to almost a decade in the case of Nepal. And the experiences were all clearly context dependent. How homogeneous is the initial group? Does the constitution-making body have other functions, and in particular, ordinary legislative functions, which is quite a common occurrence? And there were, of course, also some instructive and rather depressing object lessons of the collapse of the constitution-making process entirely in Nepal at one stage, and in many cases, some incoherence of the final draft that resulted. There was also relatively little helpful guidance on that relationship between plenary and commissions. Now, which commissions should there be? How many is ideal? How should they be constituted? Should they be a reflection of the assembly or just those people who happen to be interested in that issue? Should the commissions get some initial guiding instructions from the plenary in terms of principles or something else? What should be the interaction between the commission and the plenary during that deliberation and those deliberative and approval processes, and how should the final harmonization occur? Now, those are the range of issues that initially occurred to me in thinking about what I would say today. But listening to the discussions that have taken place already, there's another issue that keeps bubbling up, and that's the question of how do you fashion a body constituted like this body in Chile into a constitution-making body? Because much of our paper talks about building sufficient consensus, trying to work towards a win-win, doing trade-offs, and just listening to the presentations this morning. One of the big challenges also for a constitution-making body that is so broadly representative of society is how do you pull that together? How do you create leadership? Is the answer really in a technical commission in the way in which Gonzalo suggested, or is it somewhere else in trying to work out who the leaders in the assembly might be? So once the Chilean process is complete, it strikes me that it might be worthwhile for our two teams, if our PUC colleagues can bear it, to regroup, to take stock of how these issues ultimately were handled in Chilean practice, why they turned out that way, and with what results. And in that way, Chile's extremely interesting experience will be able to be captured for later constitutional processes and provide really useful guidance for the future. So thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you. And I was corrected, Gabriel Negreto is Argentine, so he's not Chilean. I misidentified him. I actually knew that. And our final speaker is Raúl Sánchez Uribarra.
Muchísimas gracias, Alex. Muchísimas gracias a todos. De verdad que me complace mucho. Le estaba escribiendo justamente a Sergio una pequeña nota diciéndole lo que me complace escuchar estas reflexiones. And I'm sorry that I'm speaking Spanish because I was writing a short note in Spanish and then I shifted to Spanish just accidentally. But what I was saying was that I was writing a very short note to Sergio, telling him how excited I was listening to the different reflections unfolding. And as I was thinking about your comments in the past few minutes, I began thinking about our thoughts, about essentially how the Constitutional Convention in Chile offers a unique opportunity to think about how we think as comparative constitutional scholars about constitution-making processes as they unfold. That was one of our goals when we initiated the project, Sergio, with the Hague Journal on the Rule of Law. At that time, we had a particular set of impressions, and I say we collectively speaking as scholars, about how the process was unfolding. And we also had a set of preoccupations, some of them stemming from the reality of the Chilean process thus far, but also in connection with other countries and how things had unfolded in other countries. With respect to that last moment, the two main examples that gravitated in people's hearts and minds as the constitution making process started in Chile was, on one hand, our dear 30-year-old Colombian constitution as an emblematic example of the hopes and aspirations of what a process can do for a nation, particularly at the moment of severe trying to move forward and transcend severe civil and political conflict. And then the rather unfortunate example of the country next door, my country, Venezuela, which unfortunately had a constitution-making process that, as we know, was abrupt, was led mostly by a single leader that, at the same time, by the way, allowed to go beyond some of the challenges that we've seen in the constitution-making process in Chile, right? I mean, a strong populist leader that in the end acts as a main decider and that functions as a very abrupt catalyst of a process, too much perhaps. So that's one of the reflections that I wanted to make about the importance of being conscious about how we're seeing the process and about reading what's being produced in the meantime about the process with that lens. And also, this takes me to the second point, to the importance, of course, of listening to the reflections now as we go through the process of constitution making, but also what that will involve for our evaluation subsequently after the final constitution takes place. So I was telling Sergio it would be perhaps, and I'm very glad that Cheryl mentions this too, perhaps it would be really important to gather our impressions at this time, from this moment, precisely as a document and testament to how we feel and how we see the process as it unfolds at the moment. That takes me to a third point that I wanted to make. And this is in connection to an experience I had a few years ago, talking at the Latin American Studies Association meeting at that time, if I recall correctly, talking about the Venezuelan process and commenting on how, in the end, the main decision-making had resided on Chavez himself and his close elite and technocrats. And there was someone present in the audience who raised her hand and said, no. Civil society had a huge impact, a huge influence in the process. So, well, love to talk to you more about it because that's not my impression. But then she began telling me a bit more about her own impression as being part of a civil society movement, participating in the process, how some of very specific solutions and norms that had been adopted had been actually impacted by their own participation. And then I realized that for an exercise of this nature, as much as we want to be truly honest to the process itself, we need to capture that that variety of experiences that happens in the same in the process, and that things can be ambivalent. Yes, it can be the case, for example, that from a particular gaze, we see the constitution making process in a particular way, and then somebody else's gaze, of course, offers another perspective that could also be partially true. And I'm saying this third point in connection to some of the reflections that we've been sharing today. I think in the end, we'll need to grapple with those ambivalences as we move forward. It will be the case that the Chilean constitution making process that has actually happened, the actual process, has been representative, has been actually very inclusive. Now we can say too inclusive in some respects, perhaps in the sense of the ambition of integrating multiple perspectives, at the same time, the limitations and challenges that can involve. We gain in some respects, but we also offer other challenges on the other hand. It makes it more difficult to achieve solutions that satisfy everyone, makes it more difficult to achieve consensuses that perhaps in the future actually are able to be effective and implemented, which is in the end what should worry us, not only the output, but ultimately how those norms will be affected and how they will be implemented in practice. And what we can see is that those tensions that we see now will probably eventuate in the future as well as they go. So as it happens, I had a set of notes that I wanted to share with you, but I scrapped them. And I hope this can be some ideas that we can use for our discussion now unfolding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raul. Now I believe Sergio wanted me to make just a few comments, and I'll be brief because we are running a bit over, and I do really want to leave time for the panelists to talk to each other more. But first, I mean, what really struck me about this special issue and the report is that it was so that comes in the middle of midstream as this is all unfolding, and to have this level and depth of reflection in the midst of a process published in a symposium is so rare and absolutely enriching. So I really congratulate you. And I, in particular, am impressed that you put together, it's, you know, people who understand law, but who are not afraid of talking about social movements and cultural narratives and the history of the country. And so I was very impressed also with the depth and the diversity of reflections on the process in the symposium. One thing that 2 points I'll make quickly, the things that haven't really come up in the discussion, which are things that I've been thinking a lot as I read and also just as I observe this process from afar, from Wisconsin and from the United States, which informs how I view things. One is that it was very striking how the interaction of two initially parallel processes took place. One was the electoral campaign and the political renewal that takes place through the elections cycle, which in many ways brought to fruition the political renewal that was the demand of the initial 2019 protests, and brings into power a new generation of politicians and a new way of doing things in many ways, we think so far. And throughout until December, each of those important moments in the electoral cycle, the primaries, the congressional election, and then the 2 rounds of the presidential election, provided really important information to the Constituent Assembly. And then, of course, the process of the Constitution was itself an issue in the presidential campaign. So I think that it's interesting to reflect on not just the Constituent Assembly, but also in the context of that presidential election. And I wonder now, Sergio mentioned that some of the questions that are raised, we might have different answers to now. I'm wondering what now Boric is in place, we know who the cabinet is, and how this affects some of the reflections that you've made, and what role will he play and his administration play in then the implementation, perhaps the prolongation and then the implementation of the new constitution. So I think it would be important to reflect on this political context. And then the other context that Lisa Hilpink alludes to in her introduction, and that has really been on my mind, is the geopolitical context. I mean, what is happening in Chile is so absolutely unique in our world. We have now, a war in Ukraine that is reconfiguring the world order. We have in the region a strong move away from democratic governance in really severe cases such as Nicaragua, but then the more gradual erosion of political institutions in Brazil and Mexico. And then in Chile, you have this political renewal through democratic processes and constitutional writing. And I wonder, I would love to hear some of the speakers reflect on how that geopolitical context will influences what's going on in Chile, what the meaning of Chile's constitution is in light of that, and is there, as the new constitution moves forward, is there any way in which the democratic backtracking in the rest of the region and beyond will affect the constitutional process in Chile? So those are very general questions, contextual questions about the constitutional process as seen from here that weren't necessarily focused on by the speakers today, and I'd love to hear some reflections on that. So again, thank you for inviting me, and let's open it up to conversations. Does anyone? Yeah, Isabel.
Maybe I can touch upon the second question that you mentioned, and I think it has the war in Ukraine has had an impact, maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe, on the discussion that we're having over the last few weeks on freedom of expression or freedom of speech. This has been a discussion within the convention from the side of media ownership, from the side of negacionismo, or the prohibition of negating certain violation of human rights specified in the text, and other discussions on freedom of speech. And I think what sort of, not the war in Ukraine, but what is happening in Russia has sort of put a light on its importance, on that freedom of speech and the press has an uncomfortable role for the authority and power. And I think sort of that is how I can see an impact on the general discussion in Chile, which has been very interesting to follow, I would say. If somebody is interested in this issue in particular, I would say that following the discussion in the convention, but also in the regulation within the rules of procedure is very, very interesting to follow. And it was not one that I would expect would emerge with such a force in the beginning.
Raul, I think you have your hand up.
Well, what I wanted to share with everyone is in the chat box, we can also make comments. And there is a comment by Mark that I think is very good for purposes of the discussion. And Mark, if you'd like to share it with us, or otherwise I'll be happy to read it.
Well, I'm happy to say it. I mean, people can read it, but what I say is I was struck by two things. First of all, the discussion of deadlines, because I think John Elser makes this point also. Everybody knows that decisions, important decisions, are always made just before the deadline occurs. Think of any faculty meeting you've been at with an important issue. What happens is at the beginning, people talk extensively and it looks like there's real deliberation. And then as the deadline, and people keep wanting to talk, and then as the deadline approaches, people start saying, well, we've got to make a decision, we've got to make a decision. Whatever the deadline is, that will be when the decision is made. And then that's not a flaw, that's a predictable, I think of it as a bureaucratic phenomenon. The second thing I was struck by was with the early comments and then later from Cheryl Saunders about coherence and the technical commissions. That strikes me as a peculiarly lawyer-like concern. And that in fact, as Cheryl suggested, many, maybe most constitutions aren't particularly coherent from a lawyer's point of view, but they're good enough. And we ought to try to figure out what makes a constitution good enough and what is a fatal flaw. Just for example, the Israeli experiment with electing a premier separately, but still having a parliamentary system. I mean, that just doesn't work. But other things, there are lots of things that'll be messy. So, and then finally, I said, my thought was, if at the end of the process, it's sort of messy and rushed, that might not be such a bad thing, because if the final product is approved, if people say, yeah, it was messy and rushed, but it's good enough, let's see what will happen to it, then after it's adopted, if it is, politics will start to play. And the things that were messy will get cleaned up or transformed or whatever. And that's, my view, probably a good thing. So those are my comments.
If others have, I have two raised hands. And then, so Cheryl Sanders, and then I'll have Cristobal and then Gabriel.
Just a quick comment on Mark, in case he was suggesting I was being overly lawyerly. Of course, there's incoherence in every constitution. The question is the degree of incoherence, and sometimes that actually makes things unworkable. And if you look at the way in which the Nepalese constitution turned out, that is an example. Over time, it may work itself out, or over time, it may just generate more chaos that's not particularly desirable in the society. So these are matters of degree in many ways. But on the point that Mark, I think, also raised in the chat about whether it's often a good thing to leave things to later decision, legislation, etc. Of course, that's right as well. There's a judgment to be made about what goes in the Constitution and what doesn't. But I just wonder what the downstream effect of a referendum has on that in this particular context. If there are things that actually matter to a particular social group in Chile, and they're not reflected adequately in the Constitution, but they're told, don't worry about it, you'll get it later. Is that going to affect the outcome of the referendum? How's that going to feed into the final approval process here?
Cristobal.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. I was wondering, this is just a thing that I'm a comment, I mean, anyone can comment about it. I was wondering whether party fragmentation that you see in the convention, right, was really boosted by the convention's election, or simply the results of the election simply manifested something that had already occurred with Chilean parties, that they were already Peronized, so to speak, that they were already super fragmented. And the convention simply manifested this and made it more honest, so to speak. And I'm saying this because I'm pretty much a fan of research done by a political scientist also at the Universidad Católica, Juan Pablo Luna, who has studied a lot the Chilean party system, and he has argued for a very long time that despite the fact that on the surface, Chilean parties look like the sort of like much more ideologically coherent organizations, since the late 1990s and the early 2000s, they have been progressively transformed into pretty much local caudillos networks, right? So I don't know, it's just something I was thinking about, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. And the other thing, and with this I'm just gonna shut up. The other thing that I was thinking about is whether some of the coordination problems that we see in the convention have to do with the fact that the 2/3 rule is only being applied at the plenum, but it's not being applied at the committee level, right? So what's happening currently is that some of the committees are not neither demographically nor ideologically representative of the plenum, right? They prepare the report, they voted by majority rule, then it goes to the plenum, it's like, surprise, doesn't pass the 2/3 threshold. So yeah, those are my comments, questions, etc.
I have Gabriel and then Sergio.
I'm sorry, I was mute. Yes, do we have some time? So I would like to make some comments about things that were said during the conversation. So I will pick up first on a comment that Isabel made. As I said, you know, if I were to rewrite or extend my paper, what I wrote at the time, I think that I will insist on a particular risk that was pretty much present at the very beginning, but I didn't want to raise that particular risk at the time, you know, and I focus on other things. But constitution making is an act of collective decision making for which we need a certain level of aggregation of preferences that is usually achieved through bargaining by organized political groups. And not just voting, but bargaining, you know, and not just deliberation, but bargaining is crucial, and you need political parties. And I think that this is a major problem in this current constitution making process. And it interacts with certain deficiencies in the rules of procedure. I will not just focus on a strict, you know, timeline, you know, whether 1 year or year and a half. Or the problem is that there was a bias from the very beginning against rules to overcome deep disagreements. It was completely rejected the idea that there could be some sort of commission, a political commission. That's something that I proposed many times at the very beginning of the process, you know, made up of political leaders of the main groups in order to propose alternative text in cases of deep disagreement. That was completely rejected. So now we have this, you know, go back and forth between commissions and the plenary without no intermediation. Actually, we just saw the rejection of a project, of a report by the Commission of the Political System that was rejected by the very people that signed that report because they wanted to renegotiate it within the commission. So in order to put pressure on some groups that they couldn't convince at the very beginning. So that's really lame, I think, from the point of view of the political process. But it emerged through a bias against negotiation behind doors. This was supposed to be a transparent public process that nobody could doubt of the honesty and the openness of the deliberations. And I think that we are seeing the consequences of that. Another point that I wanted to make is something related to what Raul said. And I don't know if that's exactly what Raul meant, but it is true that in Latin America, we have seen processes that were socially inclusive in Venezuela, as well as in Bolivia or in Ecuador in 2008. And something that comes to the fore right now in Chile is that you can have a constitution-making body that is socially inclusive or inclusive in social, cultural, ethnic, and gender terms, but politically exclusive. And that's what we are seeing. And this became very clear after the elections of the legislature and the presidential elections at the end of the year. So this is a paradox because everybody celebrated the fact that this convention was some sort of reproduction of the real plurality of Chile. But in terms of political balance of political forces and ideas and interests is not representative. And that's one of the risks that we are seeing right now in Chile. That's another point that I wanted to make, because a convention could be socially inclusive, but politically exclusive, even though we don't find here a cohesive, centralized, political party or movement, dominated the process, which is, of course, a very good thing. And something that you mentioned, Alexandra, and that's my last point, about, precisely about the elections at the end of 2021, how they affected the process. So on the one hand, they revealed, in the case of the legislative election, that the distribution of preferences and the representation that we observe in the convention is really not aligned with the true balances of political forces and interests in the country. I think it was a very biased election due to special electoral rules and also because of the disarray in the political right. I think it was an exceptional collapse or failure of the political right to mobilize voters at the time. And that led to a convention in which the political right is extremely underrepresented, for which they do represent in the real society. But in terms of the presidency, I think there are many intriguing questions right now. Everybody knows that it was a relief that Boric won because he will, he will play with the convention. He emerged from similar movements that made possible the convention. But everybody is expecting now that Boric could do something to induce self-moderation in the convention, precisely because this evident fact that the convention is not as politically representative as we once thought. And on the other hand, another issue that is currently at the center of the political debate in Chile is what the convention will do to Boric. Not just what Boric can do with the convention, but what the convention will do with Boric, because Boric forged, a government that is very moderate, that really tried to placate, criticisms about extremism, showing, that he will go along fiscal discipline, economic moderation, things like that. But the convention is not aligned with that. So the interrogation sign now is what the constitution will do to this attempt to have a more type of, a moderate center-left social democratic government. We don't know whether that could be feasible or not, depending on what will be the outcome of this process.
Sergio, I have you next.
Yes. Thank you, Alex. So I was interested in the point that Mark makes, because I think it's a very important point. In his first point, I think he's correct, right? Decisions can be made last minute. That's not a surprise. It can happen, even though actors will be anxious, and nervous in before that. But I was struck by the second and the third points, right? So the second point that Mark made is that the emphasis of incoherence and technical inconsistency maybe is not that important, if I understand it enough, if I understand it well. particularly also because of this is something normal, constitutions are inconsistent. And the third point is that many of these inconsistencies in any case can be solved later and when we defer to the political processes. But I fear that this logic is still can still be normatively bad, right? We can still challenge that, particularly when the inconsistency goes against something that scholars or some people will think that is desirable. For example, we're discussing the idea of whether Chile should be a regional state like Italy or like Spain, for example. If we have a regional state with different political sub-levels, then we will need an organ. I think this is something desirable. We will need an organ that will arbitrate the conflicts that will arise. If we lack that organ, then things can get a little bit messy. And it is unlikely that that organ will be created afterwards because of the majority requirements that may exist afterwards. So the time to create that organ is when we actually discuss the regional, whether Chile will be a regional state. But because the debate can go in parallel ways and get a little bit messy, we may not have that arbiter, and at the same time we may have a regional state. Another example that occurs to me, I was discussing this also with Isabel, has to do with the relationship with the recognition of social rights and to strong judicial review, right? So some people, and I think Mark, you have written about this, and you agree with this argument, at least in your book. Social rights are desirable. We can recognize them, but along with the weak judicial review mechanisms, right? But we have two commissions working in these issues separately, right? So we have the commission that is working on the judicial system, and we have the commission that is working on fundamental rights, and we may have strong social rights coming from the report of the Fundamental Rights Commission, and then robust judicial review. We may think that this is wrong, and we may not have enough time for the rules that are going to be approved from both committees to talk with each other well and to have a deep debate about that. So rushing things can create something that is actually not very good. And if we have a democracy that is competitive, I think we will have a democracy that is going to remain competitive. It will be unlikely that a robust judicial review system will then turn itself into a weak judicial review system. Therefore, it is very likely that this inconsistency, which I will call it, can end up with something undesirable in the end. Another example that I think is very sensitive for the Chilean debate now is how the political regime is being organized. There are no two-thirds to either a presidential regime or a parliamentary regime or any hybrid model. And there are many hybrid ideas that are turning around, and probably the report from the committee on political regime was rejected last week. So probably the political system that they will propose will be rushed, right? And it will be rushed, and it will probably be a compromise across the different sections. So we may have some inconsistencies. For example, and this is a question I will just like to leave it here. If we have a presidential regime, what would be the best way to organize the Congress? 1 or 2 chambers, how to elect them, in what electoral cycles, all these things, they need to match well together. And of course, a constitution doesn't need to match them well together, but it is unlikely that these things will be solved later necessarily.
I have both Isabel and Francisco. So we'll start with Isabel and then Francisco. And I believe we have 8 minutes left, Sergio, is that correct? Yeah. So just to give you a sense of the timing.
Okay, so just very short, to a point that Cristobal made about political parties and Juan Pablo Luna's research. Yes, we have very, or not very strong political parties for a while. Chile has an important tradition here, but we have seen the number of people who now form part of political parties and the reconfiguration of many political parties within the whole spectrum, right? We have new political parties. And I think there are 2 things here that have occurred over the last few years that can give us a sense. One is the move from one electoral system to the other. Now we have a proportional system, and that has sort of opened up for new political parties to emerge, important there to name Frente Amplio, the governing coalition, which is a very new coalition in the political party system in Chile, and it's a conglomerate of a lot of political parties. And then the other one is that during Michelle Bachelet's second government, we did a reform on the law of political parties. So much of the diagnosis was centered that these were political parties that had problems in transparency, in that they have no funding, no internal democracy, et cetera, We put a lot of effort on that. And the question is, well, what happened there? And the third thing is that the convention had special rules. Part of those special rules was giving space for more independent candidates, independent lists, which is something very unique. And I would say that the convention rules, of course, created different incentives. My question is, well, we have I think a current system that we should worry about. What is the avenue for the next decades? Should we sort of put our efforts in social movements, as has been suggested in the convention, or should we look upon incentives for strengthening the parties themselves?
Francisco.
Thank you, Alexandra. So just a couple of issues regarding the role of the president, and in line of with what Gabriel mentioned of certain assumptions being made regarding what the president will do. I think there's one further assumption, which is that it's assumed that the new president will campaign for the constitution, will support the constitution in the referendum, and it's also assumed, in line with what Alexandra said, that he will implement it sort of faithfully, right? To my mind, those two assumptions give the president stakes and leverage with regard to the discussion of the constitution, and he may use it because something's being required of him as well. But that's something that we don't know, and if he does it, it will probably be in line with moderation and with an attempt of making the constitution politically viable, as politically viable as possible. And then on the issue of political parties, that the question that Isabel raised regarding representation, we have a big problem with political parties, and that seems to be at the crux of many of our issues. So one issue I worry about, and I don't have a solution, is that the convention is achieving a new pact for Chile, and we use that sort of metaphor of a pact, an agreement, new agreement. But this is an agreement that represents whom, right? So if you have strong political parties, then the people achieving the agreement have actual representation of society. If you have players that don't fully represent political parties, or that are weak actors within their own political parties, then that may weaken also the quality of the agreement. It may make a constitution that it's appealing initially, but then the constitution will need to be defended and made sustainable in time and be well implemented, and that may create a problem. Now, regarding political representation in the constitution, so political diversity, just to highlight one issue, which is that we are changing the constitution because we have a problem with our actual constitution. And our actual constitution's main problem, I would argue, is that it's a constitution that doesn't have full allegiance from all political parties, is part of the ordinary political debate, is supported by the right and criticized by the left, and that creates a continuing problem in the political in the operation of the political system in Chile. And if this constitution has a problem of diversity, we may see the same dynamic happening over again, and not seeing a solution to our constitutional problem.
Thank you. So Raul, did you have your hand up or no?
just very briefly, and touching upon Francisco's last comments and a couple of other comments concerning Boris, which is very interesting that we didn't talk about President Boris until the end of our discussion, but it's actually one of the most important reference points in the geopolitical space. My impression is that the process in Chile and Boris' arrival in power represent a milestone in the role of the political left in Latin America, and it's being monitored and followed very closely by progressive movements and left-wing political parties across the region. Perhaps the most interesting example down the road will be Colombia, particularly if Gustavo Petro wins the election. So just bringing that to the fore, I mean, it relates nicely with your comment at the beginning, Alex, of how important the current process in Chile is and its echoes throughout the region as well.
It's 6:30, but I would, we do have one last comment, and if it's okay, Sergio and Raúl and Benjamin Garcia.
It's okay.
You have the last word, Benjamin.
Oh, that's a big responsibility, but thank you very much for the opportunity. So, I mean, probably we won't have the answer now, but my point is that we have been discussing about this combination of independent representatives and political parties within the convention. And I agree with the view that says that the broad presence of independence in the convention has caused difficulties regarding coordination and negotiation. But on the other hand, it has also provided like social and popular legitimacy, I could argue. Let's remember that at the beginning of the process, there were large sectors of the social movements and also left-wing political parties that questioned the legitimacy of the political agreement that gave rise to the process, right? So I guess my question is, how can we combine these two elements? You know, how can we integrate the popular legitimacy, even by the presence of independent representative, with the coordination role played by the political parties? Thank you.
Okay, I now cede the floor to Sergio and Raúl.
Thank you so much, Alex. No, just to thank you, everyone. We're running out of time, but it has been a very cool discussion. We were discussing with Raúl the possibility of doing a second symposium to assess the goals and discussions that we said before. Of course, perhaps in conversation with Tom and the people of the PUC as well. Because of their very interesting document, which I really recommend to read section 5 of the document, which relates to the discussion of the deadline now. I'm not sure, Tom or Raúl, you want to?
I just very briefly wanted to thank everyone for coming, and thank you on our behalf, Tom, as well, being a driving force of organizing this online workshop. And I'm actually very glad that our respective collective publications have come to appear and being discussed in the public at the same time. I think it's been very fruitful. And thank you, Alex, as well, for chairing and being with us, and to every participant. It's been fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. It's been so compelling for me and for all of us, I'm sure.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you.
Thanks.
We'll be
Thank
in
you.
touch. Bye-bye.